Hi everyone, my name is Haley Hawkins, and today I'll be presenting my capstone project, Secondary Traumatic Stress and Teacher Attrition, a Statistical Analysis. This research explores how symptoms of secondary traumatic stress, or STS, relate to teachers' intentions to leave the profession. Using binary logistic regression, I've analyzed how well we could predict attrition risk based on stress symptom scores. I'd like to thank my advisors, Dr. Cohen and Dr. DiLoretto, for their guidance throughout this project. And I'll begin with a definition of secondary traumatic stress and why this topic matters. Secondary traumatic stress, or STS, refers to trauma-like symptoms that arise from indirect exposure to someone else's trauma. It closely mirrors PTSD and is common in professions where people regularly engage with other suffering. So, for example, therapists hearing about client abuse, teachers helping traumatized students, or first responders witnessing traumatic scenes can all experience STS. Symptoms are categorized into intrusion, like unwanted thoughts, avoidance, which is steering clear of reminders, and arousal, which is heightened anxiety or irritability. Ultimately, STS affects not just mental health, but also physical and emotional well being. So teachers are especially vulnerable to STS. They may witness trauma directly, such as school violence, or indirectly when students bring trauma from home, like abuse or food insecurity or neglect. This is especially true in Title I schools or high needs areas where trauma exposure is more frequent. Research has shown that teacher well-being is directly impacted by these stressors, which are often compounded by poor working conditions or limited institutional support. So chronic stress doesn't just stay as STS, it can escalate into full burnout. And burnout includes emotional exhaustion, growing cynicism towards the job, and feelings of professional inefficacy. And teachers can experience burnout for a variety of different reasons, whether it is emotional burden, or personal burnout, systemic issues, which are work related, or dealing with disengaged students causing student related burnout. Ultimately, burnout is a major contributor to teachers leaving the profession, and it's often preceded by prolonged and unaddressed secondary traumatic stress. STS is often measured using the secondary traumatic stress scale, which it consists of 17 items covering intrusion, avoidance, and arousal. Previous studies found that STS strongly predicts attrition even beyond other known factors like self-efficacy and classroom demands. Though some studies didn't directly measure STS, they observed similar patterns like student apathy or lack of administrative support, strongly aligning with STS related stressors. For the current study, I used data from the secondary traumatic stress scale to predict teacher attrition, specifically in Northwest Florida. All right, so the primary research goal was to assess whether STSS scores could predict which teachers plan to leave the profession. To do this, I used a statistical method called binary logistic regression, which is ideal when the outcome is binary. So in this case, stay versus leave. Logistic regression works by estimating the probability of an event happening, such as a teacher deciding to leave. Predictor variables like STSS scores can be continuous or categorical. If they are categorical, we convert them into dummy variables. So this model doesn't just tell us whether a predictor matters, it also tells us how much it changes the odds of the event. In this case, the odds of the teacher leaving. Right. The logistic function calculates the probability that an outcome will occur based on the predictors. So rather than predicting the outcome directly, we model the log odds of the event. And these log odds can be exponentiated into odds ratios. An odds ratio over 1 indicates a higher likelihood of the event. For example, an odds ratio of 1.5 means there is a 50% increase in the odds of the teacher leaving for each unit increase in the predictor. For logistic regression to be valid, a few assumptions must be met. First, the outcome must be binary. Secondly, the observations need to be independent. There also shouldn't be any correlation between the predictors. Also, continuous predictors should relate linearly to the log odds. And lastly, we need enough data, typically at least 10 events per predictor. Once the model is built, we evaluate its fit and predictive power using a variety of statistical tests and metrics. For this project, I used RStudio, and I used several packages for data cleaning, model building, and the evaluation. The key predictors in the models are the STSS total score and its 3 subscales: intrusion, avoidance, and arousal. The outcome variable was whether a teacher reported planning to leave the profession. And the models estimate the probability of that outcome based on the teacher's stress scores. All right, the data for this project came from a teacher wellness survey developed by Dr. DiLoretto. It was distributed to schools in Northwest Florida. So while the survey included several items, I focused on the STSS scores and the teaching intent for this analysis. Out of 107 teachers who responded, 3 were unsure about their plans, so I analyzed 104 participants, out of which 70 planned to stay and 34 planned to leave. This slide shows both the overall attrition intent and how STSS scores were distributed across groups. Teachers planning to leave tended to have a higher total STSS score, especially on the intrusion and the avoidance subscales. Interestingly, the arousal scores were slightly higher in those planning to stay. After seeing this, while doing some exploratory data analysis, I generated summary statistics and ran a few tests on the data. The summary statistics showed that the average STSS scores are consistently higher for those intending to leave. The Shapiro-Wilk test indicated that our data weren't normally distributed, specifically in the stay group. So this led me to use a non-parametric Wilcoxon test. And the results of the Wilcoxon test confirmed that there were significant differences in the scores between both groups of teachers. Here, I looked at correlations between the total STSS scores and the subscale scores and the intent to leave. We saw that all 3 subscales are strongly correlated with each other and with the total score. So this suggests some redundancy, which can cause issues in regression modeling. I'll talk more about that in a little bit later. Correlations between STS scores and intent to leave were modest, ranging from about 0.18 to 0.22, suggesting that STS influences teacher attrition, but it is not the only factor. Now for the modeling and the results from this. To begin the modeling portion, STSS responses were recoded on a 1 to 5 Likert scale. I calculated total and subscale scores based on the standard STSS structure. And teaching intent was recoded as a binary outcome, 1 if the teacher planned to leave and 0 if they planned to stay. The first model used the total STSS score to predict teacher attrition. This model was statistically significant with an odds ratio of 1.03. So that means for each point increase in the total STSS score, that increases the odds of the teacher leaving by about 3.2%. Though small, the effect here is meaningful and supports the role of STS in teacher turnover. Next, I tested the three subskills together. So this model was actually not statistically significant. None of the subskills turned out to be strong individual predictors in this model, and this was likely due to multicollinearity. So the variance inflation factor actually confirmed this issue. So I tested each subskill individually next. And we saw when modeled separately, both intrusion and avoidance significantly predicted attrition. A 1 point increase in the intrusion score raised the odds of the teacher leaving by 11%, and a 1 point increase in the avoidance score raised the odds of the teacher leaving by 7%. The third subskill, arousal, was not significant, but the data did suggest that it might be trending in that direction based on the p-value. Right, so comparing all of these significant models, I found that models 1 and 3 performed best because they both had the lowest AIC values. When addressing the individual symptoms, Model 3 focused on intrusion was slightly more informative than the avoidance model. So this supports the idea that intrusion, which are those unwanted thoughts and memories, might be a particularly harmful aspect of STS for teachers. And next, I assessed the adequacy of the models using several diagnostic tests. The Hosmer-Lemeshow test showed good model fit for both. Both models predicted with around 70% accuracy, and both models also had high rates of sensitivity, meaning that they could accurately identify those teachers who would leave. However, both models could improve on specificity, which is being able to accurately identify teachers who will stay. Another measure was the ROC curves, and they confirmed moderate predictive power. So the area under the curve was around 0.63 to 0.64 for the models. Now, this table shows the predicted probability that a teacher plans to leave the profession based on their stress score. So I modeled this using the total STSS score and the intrusion score, which were the best performing predictors. And I saw that at the 10th percentile, very low stress, the predicted chance of planning to leave is around 20%. At the average stress level, that predicted risk increases to about 32%. And at the 90th percentile, meaning high STS, the risk of attrition jumps to 46%. These predicted probabilities are very close to the actual attrition rate that we saw in the sample, which was about 33%. So that alignment gives greater confidence in both models' ability to predict, and it supports the idea that higher secondary traumatic stress is clearly associated with an increased risk of attrition. Now, this graph gives a visual representation of the model's results. The x-axis shows the STS scores, and the y-axis shows the predicted probability of leaving the profession. Both lines show the same general trend. As stress levels increase, the likelihood of attrition escalates rapidly. And you'll notice that the intrusion model rises more steeply than the total STSS model. That fits our earlier finding that the intrusion symptoms were the strongest individual predictor of the attrition risk. But it is also too important to keep in mind here that the intrusion score only goes up to 25, while the total STS score goes up to 85. So part of that steepness is because of the smaller range. Still, this visualization makes it clear that STS isn't just theoretical, but it has real and measurable effects on teachers' decisions and workforce retention. Right, now, for the conclusion, what did we learn from from this. So first, both Model 1, which was the total STS score, and Model 3, the intrusion score, were statistically significant, and they offered meaningful predictions. A 1-point increase in the total STSS score increased the odds of the teacher leaving by about 3%, and a 1% increase in the intrusion score raises the odds of the teacher leaving by about 11%, making it the strongest predictor. Both models, they showed high sensitivity, meaning they were effective at identifying teachers who intended to leave. However, they also had low specificity, which means that the models mistakenly flagged many teachers as at risk of leaving, even though they actually planned to stay. So while the predictive power wasn't perfect, the findings here are still valuable because they highlight a clear pattern. Those teachers experiencing high STS, especially intrusive symptoms, are much more likely to consider leaving. This isn't just about stress, it's about how the unaddressed emotional tolls can affect both teacher retention and student learning when those teachers leave. And these results point to a shared responsibility for districts, administrators, and training programs to take more proactive steps in protecting and promoting teacher mental health. Right, so how can we respond to this challenge? First, we need systemic solutions. The trauma-informed practices should be integrated into both teacher preparation programs and ongoing professional development, especially for those teachers who are serving in high-needs schools. Teachers also need peer support networks and access to mental health staff. Equally important is a strong and supportive administrative leadership. Supportive environments truly make a difference. Looking ahead into future research, there are many promising directions. Adding demographic and contextual predictors, such as a teacher's years of experience, the grade level taught, and the school setting, all of those can help improve the model's accuracy. Additionally, exploring how adjusting the classification threshold might affect predictions for different teacher subgroups would be valuable. And another important avenue for investigation would be the potential interactions between secondary traumatic stress and school level factors like leadership style. Those also could influence attrition risk. So finally here, it's important to acknowledge the bottom line, and that is STS is real and it is common. If we want to keep skilled and compassionate educators in the classroom, addressing the emotional impact of trauma exposure must be a priority. To close, here are the references that supported this research. They include the key studies and the methods that I used. So if you want to explore any of these topics further, these are great starting points. Thank you for listening.